I speak to you today, not as a ruler seeking applause, not as a man intoxicated by power, and not as someone who believes this world will remember my name forever, but as a servant who understands that every breath I take is already being counted, every intention I hide is already written, and every step I walk is carrying me closer to a day from which there is no escape, a day when uniforms, titles, medals, flags, microphones, palaces, and armies will all be stripped away, and only the truth of who we were before Allah will remain. Because the Day of Judgment is not a story meant to frighten children or decorate sermons. It is a reality that will arrive with absolute certainty. A day when the sky will be torn apart, when mountains will be crushed into dust, when the earth will vomit its secrets, when graves will open, and when humanity will stand naked before the Lord of the worlds with no lawyer, no interpreter, and no protection except sincere faith and righteous deeds. And I remind myself before I remind you that leadership on earth is not elevation, but exposure. Because the higher a person stands in this world, the heavier his accountability will be in the next. And I fear that day when I will be asked not how loudly I spoke about justice, but how honestly I practiced it. Not how many speeches I gave about dignity, but how many times I defended it when it was inconvenient. Not how fiercely I opposed oppression, but whether I ever benefited from silence when oppression favored me. Because on that day, excuses will not be accepted, intentions will be unveiled, and even the smallest betrayal will appear larger than mountains. And I tell you openly that the day of judgment is the only court where power has no immunity, where wealth has no influence, where lineage offers no advantage, and where even prophets will say myself, except by the mercy of Allah. And I ask you to imagine that moment, when the scales are set, when deeds are weighed with precision beyond human comprehension, when a single act of kindness done in secret can outweigh years of public praise, and a single injustice committed without fear can drag a person into regret that will last forever. And I ask you to ask yourselves the question that keeps me awake at night. If today were the last sunset of our lives, if tonight were the final night before the trumpet is blown, what would we carry with us to stand before Allah? Because the Day of Judgment does not ask how advanced our technology was, how modern our cities looked, or how powerful our nations appeared. It asks how we treated the weak, how we spoke the truth when lies were profitable, how we restrained our anger when revenge felt sweet, how we remembered Allah when the world tried to make us forget Him. And I tell you that no revolution is complete if it does not begin inside the soul, because a society that forgets accountability before Allah will eventually collapse under its own corruption. And I warn myself and you that the greatest deception is not disbelief, but delay, the lie that says later, the whisper that says not now, the illusion that repentance can be postponed because the angel of death does not announce his arrival, and the grave does not care about unfinished plans, and the Day of Judgment does not accept intentions that were never acted upon. And I stand here reminding myself that strength without humility is a curse, courage without sincerity is a trap, and leadership without fear of Allah is a road that ends in humiliation, on a day when faces will either shine with light or be darkened by regret. And I swear by the one who created life and death that no victory on earth is worth losing peace in the grave, no political success is worth failure in the hereafter, and no worldly achievement is worth standing ashamed before Allah with empty hands. And I speak to the young who believe the world will last forever, to the powerful who believe accountability is for others, to the poor who believe Allah has forgotten them. And I say that the Day of Judgment equalizes all illusions, because the oppressed will finally be heard, the oppressor will finally be stopped, tears that were swallowed will finally be answered, and justice that seemed delayed will arrive with terrifying perfection. And I remind myself that every prayer ignored, every trust broken, every lie normalized, every life treated cheaply, every orphan neglected, and every arrogant decision will return to its owner on a day when regret will be louder than screams. And I ask you to imagine standing alone while your book of deeds is opened, pages flipping not with ink, but with memories you thought were buried, moments you assumed were forgotten, sins you justified, good deeds you underestimated. And I ask you, what defense will we offer when even our own limbs will testify against us, when our tongues will be sealed, and truth will speak without distortion? Because the Day of Judgment is not negotiable, it is not symbolic, it is not metaphorical, it is real, absolute, and unavoidable. And I remind myself that the only successful person on that day is not the one who ruled the longest, but the one who feared Allah the most. Not the one who accumulated the most, but the one who gave sincerely. Not the one who was feared by people, but the one who feared standing before his Lord. And I say this with a heart that trembles, because the reminder of the day of judgment is not meant to paralyze us with fear, but to awaken us with responsibility, to purify our intentions, to soften our hearts, to discipline our power, and to realign our lives toward a purpose greater than this temporary world. And I continue without pause, because the reminder of the day of judgment does not pause. It advances relentlessly, just as time advances toward its final hour. And I tell myself before I tell you that every sunrise is a subtraction from our remaining chances. Every sunset is a silent witness against how we spent the day. And every night that passes without sincere repentance is a night closer to standing before Allah with unanswered questions. Because the day of judgment will not ask us what we intended to become. It will ask what we actually did when truth demanded sacrifice. And I remind myself that nations rise and fall not by the strength of their weapons, but by the weight of their morality, because when a society forgets that Allah is watching, corruption becomes normal, oppression becomes justified, and injustice begins to wear the mask of law. And I fear that day when leaders will be asked about every life affected by their decisions, every mother who cried because of negligence, every child whose future was sold for convenience, every poor man whose dignity was crushed by arrogance. Because authority is not ownership, it is trust. And trust on the day of judgment becomes either a shield or a chain around the neck. And I say clearly that Islam does not teach us to fear accountability. It teaches us to prepare for it. Because the believer does not run from the day of judgment. He works for it. He corrects himself before being corrected. He humbles himself before being humbled. And he seeks forgiveness before forgiveness is no longer available. And I speak to my own heart when I say that power is a test more dangerous than poverty, because poverty pushes you toward patience, but power tempts you toward arrogance, and arrogance is the disease that destroyed nations before us, nations that thought their strength would protect them, their wealth would save them, and their legacy would preserve them, yet today they exist only as lessons written in dust. And I ask myself, what lesson will we leave behind? A lesson of justice or a warning of hypocrisy? Because the day of judgment will resurrect not only individuals, but the truth about civilizations. And I remind myself that Allah does not need our speeches, our slogans, or our appearances. He looks into hearts. He weighs sincerity. He judges actions done in secret more heavily than words spoken in public. And I fear standing before Allah knowing that people praised me while He questioned me. Because what value does applause have in a place where only deeds speak? And I say to every soul listening that repentance is not humiliation, it is honor. Lowering yourself before Allah is not weakness, it is strength. And fearing the day of judgment does not make you passive, it makes you disciplined, it makes you conscious. It makes you careful with every word, every decision, every intention, because you know that nothing disappears, nothing is lost, and nothing escapes the record. And I remind myself that even silence is recorded, especially silence in the face of injustice, because the day of judgment will expose not only those who committed wrong, but those who watched it happen and benefited from comfort. And I say that the grave is not the end of life, but the beginning of clarity, where titles fade instantly and reality becomes unavoidable, where the soul meets the consequences of what the body chose. And I speak to the youth again, because you are told that life is long and mistakes are normal. But the day of judgment does not measure age, it measures awareness. And a young person who feared Allah can outrank an elder who delayed repentance. And I remind myself that the greatest tragedy is not to die poor, unknown, or uncelebrated, but to die with a heart attached to this world and empty of preparation for the next. Because the day of judgment does not negotiate with regret. It does not rewind moments. It does not accept excuses shaped by fear. And I ask you to imagine the moment when paradise is brought near and hellfire is exposed, when reality overwhelms imagination, when the soul understands with certainty that every warning was true, every reminder was mercy, and every delay was a mistake. And I tremble at the thought that some will realize too late that they traded eternity for temporary comfort. And I beg myself and you not to be among those who wake up only when waking up no longer benefits them. Because Allah is merciful now, forgiving now, accepting now, but the day of judgment is a day of justice, not opportunity. And I remind myself that every sincere prayer whispered in loneliness, every tear shed in repentance, every act of justice done quietly, Every temptation resisted for the sake of Allah builds a fortress that will matter more than any army on that day. And I speak these words, knowing that reminders are heavy because truth is heavy. But hearts that are alive can carry it, and hearts that are dead will always find it uncomfortable. And I conclude this continuation by saying that the day of judgment is not meant to steal our hope, is meant to purify it, not meant to crush our ambition, but to redirect it toward what lasts, and not meant to make us fear life, but to make us live it with purpose, restraint, and sincerity, because only those who remember the day of judgment while walking this earth will stand with peace when that day finally arrives. And I press forward with this reminder because stopping would betray its urgency, and I tell myself again that the day of judgment is closer than our next breath, closer than our next decision, closer than the plans we foolishly assume we will complete. And I remind my own soul that Allah did not create us to wander without purpose, nor to compete endlessly for dominance, nor to drown in distraction until death surprises us, but to live consciously, responsibly, and humbly under His watch. Because the day of judgment strips away all illusions and leaves only truth standing. And I ask myself, what will remain of me when my voice is gone, when my image fades, when history turns the page, because the grave does not recognize status, it recognizes sincerity, and the hereafter does not. Reward reputation, it rewards righteousness. And I speak to every heart, burdened by fear of the future, and say that no future is more important than the one after death, because the world promises endlessly and delivers little, while the hereafter promises clearly and never breaks its word. And I remind myself that injustice may appear powerful in this life, but it is fragile before Allah, because every oppressed soul carries a prayer that travels directly to the heavens, and on the day of judgment those prayers will return as witnesses, not whispers. And I tremble knowing that even unintentional harm is recorded, even careless words are preserved, even pride hidden behind confidence is exposed, because Allah sees not only what we do, but why we do it. And I speak to leaders of every kind when I say that authority is not permission, it is responsibility, and the day of judgment will not ask how strong your grip was, but how gentle your justice remained, how fair your decisions were, how often you chose conscience over convenience, because leadership without fear of Allah becomes tyranny even when it wears the clothes of order. And I remind myself that the Prophet taught us that the most beloved people to Allah are those most beneficial to others, not those most admired. And I ask myself if my existence lightened burdens or added to them, healed wounds or ignored them, defended dignity or delayed it. Because the day of judgment will replay our lives not as we remember them, but as they truly were. And that truth will be unbearable for some and liberating for others. And I remind myself that repentance is not a moment, it is a lifestyle. A constant return to Allah whenever heart drifts, because drifting is human, but refusing to return is arrogance. And arrogance is the fastest road to humiliation on that day, when the arrogant will wish they were dust. And I speak to the youth once more because your strength is temporary, but your record is permanent. Your energy is a blessing, but your accountability is real. And every choice you normalize today will shape how heavy or light your scale becomes tomorrow. And I remind myself that Allah is not unjust. He does not punish effort. He does not ignore struggle. And He does not waste sincerity, even when the world does. And I say clearly that the believer does not measure success by applause, but by acceptance from Allah. Because acceptance on the day of judgment outweighs every victory celebrated in this world. And I warn myself against hypocrisy, because it is the most dangerous enemy of faith. Allowing a person to look righteous while rotting inside. And the day of judgment will shatter hypocrisy more brutally than open disbelief, because it thrives on deception. And I remind myself that every blessing carries a question, every comfort carries accountability, and every ease carries a responsibility to remember those without it. Because the day of judgment will ask not only what we took, but what we gave, not only what we enjoyed, but what we shared. And I imagine the moment when souls will run toward their books of deeds, some receiving them in their right hands with relief, others in their left with despair. And I ask myself which direction I am walking toward today, because direction is chosen long before destination arrives. And I remind myself that Allah's mercy is vast, but it is not mocked for. Forgiveness is open, but it is not forced. And the door of repentance stands wide, but it does not remain open forever. And I beg my own heart not to delay returning, not to delay correcting, not to delay surrendering pride for humility, because the day of judgment will reward those who feared it while unseen, who prepared for it while alive, and who remembered Allah when forgetting Him was easier. And I continue speaking because this reminder is not meant to end abruptly, just as accountability does not end when the speech ends. And I say that if these words make you uncomfortable, it is because comfort has made us forgetful. And if they make you reflective, it is because your heart is still alive. And I pray that Allah keeps my heart alive enough to fear standing before Him, because that fear is not darkness, it is light, not paralysis, it is guidance and not despair, it is hope disciplined by truth. Because only those who remember the day of judgment while walking this earth will walk calmly when the earth itself begins to shake.